What happens when a powerful civilization, one that controls intergalactic trade and follows its own rules, encounters a species that seems small and insignificant but actually carries in its DNA the power to transform everything around it? The Fatil, one of the oldest and most imposing powers in the galaxy, laughed at us. They laughed at humanity, at our way of negotiating, at our ignorance of the complex rules that govern the cosmos. But then, we did something no one expected. We spoke their lost language, the dead tongue of their ancestors, and everything changed. What seemed like a simple translation error turned into an intergalactic revolution. A human, once seen merely as a translator, challenged the foundations of a civilization that prided itself on its supremacy over galactic commerce. Imagine this: a single word, a clause forgotten for millennia, and the Fatil Consortium, with all its strength and power, was forced to reevaluate its own laws and contracts. We, who had been considered mere apprentices in the art of negotiation, showed the Fatil that sometimes true strength does not lie in what is said, but in how one chooses to say it. The story you are about to hear is not just about a successful negotiation. It is about the power that every human being possesses, even if at first glance they seem weak or insignificant. It is about how, when empowered with the right knowledge, we can turn the game around and show an entire galaxy that perhaps humans still have a more important role to play than anyone could have imagined. So, what happened when we spoke the Yo, lost language of the Fatil? Get ready to find out. Omar Ahmad had always felt that there was more to languages than mere communication. His passion for linguistics was not limited to learning new words or conjugations. To him, every language was a window into a culture, a history, a way of thinking that unfolded through the lines of forgotten grammars and vocabularies. And it was in his career as a professor of xenolinguistics that he delved deep into alien languages, discovering complexities that only the oldest civilizations could comprehend. However, Omar's life was about to take an unexpected turn. As he was explaining the meticulous structure of Fatil, an alien language as ancient as its civilization, his lecture was interrupted by an unusual visitor. The sound of the door opening echoed through the silent room, and Matthew Dowse, the billionaire CEO of Dowse Technology, walked in with a confident smile on his face. He was no ordinary visitor. He was a man with a plan that could change everything for Omar. The offer was almost irresistible. Matthew Dowse, with his immaculate suit and aura of power, offered Omar the chance to be directly involved in intergalactic negotiations with the Fatil Trade Consortium. This consortium was one of the most influential and secretive economic powers in the galaxy, and its secrets were buried under layers of linguistic complexity. The translators at Dowse Technology had failed miserably in their attempts to understand Fatil, and this was damaging trade agreements, threatening billions of credits. It was a mistake that not even machines could correct. Dowse's proposal was clear. Omar, the expert in alien languages, would be the missing link. He would be generously paid per day, have all expenses covered, and gain the opportunity to explore the inner workings of the most powerful commercial network in the universe. However, even with the weight of the offer in his hands, Omar couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had studied Fatil for years, and something about the language's patterns had always intrigued him. It wasn't just words being conveyed, but veiled intentions, ancient codes, and ceremonies of a long-lost civilization. For the Fatil, language wasn't merely a tool for communication. It was an extension of their political and religious identity. Every phrase spoken was tied to centuries of history. It was clear to Omar what seemed like a simple commercial proposal could be hiding a much more complex game. What he was about to uncover could alter not just his life, but the structure of galactic commerce itself. As intrigued and challenged as he was by Dowse's offer, Omar couldn't ignore the sense of manipulation in the deal. He knew that in any intergalactic transaction, words were more than simple meanings. They carried with them the unspoken rules that governed negotiations. Every clause hid traps that could be fatal for the unprepared. Was he merely a pawn in Dowse's game, or had he been chosen for his skills for something far greater? The sensation of being on the verge of crossing the line between academia and the world of intergalactic power fascinated him, but he knew that before accepting anything, he needed to clearly understand the rules of the game. He had to further explore the hidden aspects of the lost language, and more specifically, the mysteries concealed between the lines of Fatil. Over the following weeks, Omar dedicated himself entirely to understanding the complexities of every word, phrase, and meaning he had studied, but never truly comprehended. With each moment he spent with Fatil, he became more convinced that there was something far deeper at play. The flaws in the translators were not accidental. They were dealing with a language that not only had complex layers of meaning, but also had roots tracing back to a distant past, long before the Fatal Trade Consortium became the empire it was today. It was as if the language were an echo of an extinct civilization, a mystery that could either liberate or destroy those who dared to explore it. With this perspective, Omar began to see his mission in a new light. He was not just a translator, he was a mediator between two galactic cultures. He was the guardian of an ancient code that could unlock doors no one else knew existed. As he examined ancient negotiation documents, he found clues suggesting that the Fatal legal system did not merely follow modern conventions, but was based on lost laws dating back to a pre-collapse civilization. If he could figure out how to use this information, he could not only gain influence in negotiations, but also turn the game in favor of humanity. The Fatal might be a superpower, but they were bound to a system that, while powerful, no longer fit the new realities of intergalactic trade. That was when Omar's perception began to shift. He was no longer dealing with mere words or agreements. He was dealing with the very foundations of an entire galaxy, with the power of language and knowledge as weapons. Every word, every clause in Fatil had the potential to change the course of intergalactic history. But the real question was he prepared to manipulate this language for purposes even the Fatal could not foresee? To understand this, he knew he would need the help of someone who understood the depths of the past like no one else. His mentor, Juliet Roberts. If she had the answers, he might be on the verge of discovering that the game of intergalactic power was not just about wealth, but about total control over the language and laws that governed the galaxy. And so, Omar began to prepare for what lay ahead, knowing that the answers he sought might be more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The future of humanity and the galaxy could be defined by the words he was able to understand, and more importantly, by the words he was able to manipulate. And the question that loomed in the air was, how far was he willing to go to ensure humanity had its place in the galaxy? When Matthew Dowse made his proposal to Omar, he had no idea of the whirlwind he was about to unleash. On the surface, it was an irresistible offer, an exorbitant sum, more than enough to pay off all of Omar's debts, more than enough to guarantee a life of luxury. It was like a direct invitation to the center of intergalactic power, a world that Omar, as an academic, had never imagined he would one day have access to. The proposal did not come with just money. It came with access to information, to secrets that few dared to explore. Dow's technology was not merely interested in improving their translations. They desperately needed someone like Omar to mediate the impossible. With his skills in xenolinguistics, he could decipher Fatil, the language of the ancient intergalactic merchants, which was obstructing the most valuable trade agreements in the galaxy. And that was the crucial point. Dow's technologies, translators were failing, and the mistakes being made were undermining deals worth billions of credits. But there was something more to all of this, something Omar could not immediately identify. The offer was too good to be true, and he knew that behind every great deal, there was always something that could change everything. Omar stared intently at Dowse, trying to absorb every word the billionaire was saying. Dowse was offering a millionaire salary, but there was more. Much more. Direct access to the Fatal Trade Consortium was the real prize, a power he had never imagined having. The Fatil Consortium was a political and economic force of colossal proportions. They controlled trade routes, infinite wealth, and a network of alliances stretching across the galaxy. Omar realized that accepting the offer meant stepping into a world where language was more than just communication. It was power, influence, and control. Understanding the Fatil language was not just a scholarly pursuit. It was the key to shaping the future of intergalactic relations. And as he weighed the consequences of his decision, one thought lingered in his mind. Was he ready to wield that power? The Taoist technology wanted to dominate these routes, to explore these markets, but for that, they needed someone capable of understanding the Fatil language, which, like the Fatil themselves, was complex, enigmatic, and full of nuances. Omar knew that this was not just a negotiation. It was an entry into a new world. But he also knew that something was not right. The offer seemed too good, and Taoist was not the type to offer favors without a very specific reason. Omar began to question whether there was more to this deal than he could understand at first glance. In his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden. Yes, Taoist's proposal was tempting, but what was really at stake? The Fatil were not known for being friendly or trustworthy. They were an ancient race, with a legal code that dated back centuries, perhaps even millennia, before Taoist technology had even existed. For a human, negotiating with a Fatil was not just a matter of words. It was a matter of honor, of power, and of course of manipulation. The Fatil were well aware of the weight their language carried, and if there were any translation errors, it could affect not just business, but even the balance of power between civilizations. A small mistranslation could destroy the entire negotiation, and Taoist knew it. Perhaps that was what they were trying to avoid, but the price for such precision was far higher than any amount Omar had ever imagined. Omar was no fool. He knew that accepting Taoist's proposal meant more than just a good paycheck or a new status. He would be diving headfirst into a web of power and influence far greater than he could comprehend. He knew that Taoist technology was no ordinary company. It was a giant in the sector, with ties extending to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But the Fatil Trade Consortium was something else entirely. They did not play by the same set of rules. For them, negotiation was not just about goods and credits. It was a battle of intelligence, a game of trust, and often a test of who controlled the narrative. And Omar was about to become a key piece in that game, without even knowing exactly what his role would be. He was being pulled into an arena where the rules were unclear, and where any mistake could mean not just the end of the negotiation, but the end of his own career. Omar felt the weight of the decision. As tempting as the offer was, he couldn't help but wonder, what did Taoist really want? Who were they working for? Intergalactic trade negotiations were always complicated, but this seemed to be a far more complex game, where every spoken word could have implications stretching across decades or even centuries. Taoist was offering more than just a job opportunity. They were offering the key to a world of secrets and alliances that even Omar could not foresee. The question was he ready for it? Was he prepared to deal with the complexities of the Fatil language while also handling the subtle manipulations that always surfaced in transactions of such magnitude? Was he ready to change the course of history, not just for humans, but for the entire galaxy? Omar knew that by accepting the proposal, he wouldn't just be gaining a job. He would be becoming part of something much bigger and probably more dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. There was, however, a part of Omar that craved this challenge. He knew that his skills could finally be recognized on a scale he had never imagined. Xenolinguistics had never been a field that brought fame or wealth, but it had the power to connect worlds, to unravel secrets that remained beyond the reach of most. Taoist's proposal offered that, and more. It offered the chance to play on the grandest stage possible, where the stakes were galactic, and where he, Omar Ahmad, could become a central figure in one of the most important negotiations in intergalactic history. But as he thought about it, he also knew that he was about to step into a territory where the consequences of a mistake were incalculable. He needed to be ready to play the game, not just with the words he mastered, but also with the ability to read gestures, intentions, and the silences that were about to unfold. Finally, he took a step toward his decision, but a part of his mind still hesitated. Omar knew that by accepting, he would have to go beyond academic knowledge. He would have to learn to navigate a field that blended politics, power, and the most complex intergalactic negotiations. For that, he would need more than just his knowledge of alien languages. He would need to master the art of intergalactic negotiation and, above all, learn to manipulate the fatal legal system. This would be the key to untangling the knot that had been preventing the negotiations from moving forward. He would not only become the link between humans and the Fatil, but also someone who, through words and forgotten laws, could alter the fate of the negotiations and galactic trade. But for that, he needed to know exactly what was being played against him. Omar finally looked into Daos's eyes, his decision already made. He would accept the proposal. But a new question arose in his mind. What would be the next move he needed to make to ensure humanity emerged victorious in this game? Omar knew that accepting Daos's offer meant diving into uncharted waters, not just because of the magnitude of the challenge, but because of the complexity of what he was about to uncover about the Fatil Trade Consortium. From the very first days of his work with the consortium, he realized that negotiations were more than mere commercial transactions. They were wrapped in an almost mystical ceremony, which the Fatil seemed to treat with reverence. But that wasn't the only thing that unsettled him. During his linguistic analyses, he noticed something peculiar in the grammatical structures and phrases used in the negotiations. It was as if there was something familiar in the Fatil's words, something he had studied before but couldn't immediately identify. As the negotiations intensified, Omar began to see a pattern, a connection between the language and a code much older than anything he had ever encountered. He knew he was dealing with something much greater, something that could change the course of history. In one of his first meetings with the CEO of the consortium, Bazis Bodis Sarian, an imposing Fatil with his skeletal frame and his multi-eyed expression, Omar sensed that something was unfolding before him. During the meeting, the Fatil made a proposal that seemed entirely ordinary, but the way the sentence was structured echoed something Omar had read in an ancient text, a translation made by his mentor, Juliet Roberts. As the conversation deepened, he realized what was happening. The Fatil were using a language that traced back to an ancestral civilization, a language thought to be extinct for centuries, yet somehow still alive within the consortium's trade transactions. It was a revolutionary discovery. He now understood that the Fatil consortium was not merely negotiating with humans and other alien races. They were following a legal and cultural code older than the galaxy itself, as they knew. This code, seemingly lost to most, still governed the Fatil's behavior in their dealings. The idea of a trade language had a depth Omar had never imagined. The Fatil were, in reality, preserving the practices and laws of an ancient civilization, whose origins stretched back long before the consortium itself had even existed, and this discovery was a double-edged sword. If he understood enough about these ancient legal clauses, he could manipulate the negotiations in ways the Fatil hadn't anticipated. But to do so, he needed knowledge far beyond his current grasp. He knew the answer lay in something that had been neglected for millennia, the forgotten legal traditions of an ancestral civilization. Determined to explore this path, Omar delved into ancient archives and the translations he had made throughout his career. During his research, he stumbled upon a specific passage that referenced a concept called the right of secondary consultation. It was an obscure legal clause mentioned in several ancient texts, but never fully explained. Omar realized with a chill down his spine that this right was directly tied to the power to invoke a review of negotiations under the terms of the ancient civilization. This meant that, if he knew how to correctly invoke this clause, he could force the consortium to reopen all ongoing negotiations based on a legal code they believed to be forgotten. But how could he, a human, invoke a clause from an alien civilization without suffering consequences? He knew he needed more than just knowledge. He needed a strategy that could be executed with precision, without the Fatil realizing what was happening. Desperate, Omar sought out the only person who could help him understand the implications of this discovery. his former mentor, Juliet Roberts. Juliet, one of the greatest experts in alien linguistics, was more than familiar with the ancient texts of various forgotten civilizations. Their relationship was not just that of mentor and student, but a partnership that had spanned years of joint research. When he reached her, explaining his discovery, she immediately recognized the weight of what he had found. Through the records she had kept, Juliet revealed that the right of secondary consultation was not merely a legal clause, but a fundamental commercial ritual that the Fatal could not ignore. Once properly invoked, this right would compel the Fatal to renegotiate any agreement under the terms of a previous civilization, with all the advantages that entailed. It was the key to breaking the consortium's monopoly and bringing justice to all races dependent on trade agreements. The revelation was monumental, but also dangerous. Upon realizing the true extent of his power over the Fatal, Omar felt torn. He held in his hands a powerful weapon, capable of not only changing the course of commercial negotiations, but also challenging the very structure of the Fatal Consortium's power. He could use this information to his advantage and perhaps even secure a fairer deal for humanity. But there was a risk. That knowledge was highly dangerous, both for humans and the Fatil themselves. If he were discovered attempting to manipulate the ancient clauses, it could spark an intergalactic revolution. He could not act hastily. Every move needed to be calculated, every word chosen with care. He was about to challenge the laws of the universe as they were known, and the power of a lost language was about to be revealed in all its splendor. But what Omar did not yet know was that the real battle was about to begin. He was only beginning to understand what was at stake. The feeling of standing on the brink of something grand and perilous filled Omar with a growing urgency. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to find them. Juliet Roberts was the key to understanding the implications of the right of secondary consultation and the ancient laws that now seemed to be the last line of defense against the overwhelming power of the Fatil. When he sought her out, it was not just for her academic expertise, but for the depth of her understanding of languages that had been buried in the mists of time. Juliet was one of the few people in the universe who knew more about ancient languages than anyone else. She was not just a mentor, she was the guardian of secrets that could change the galaxy. Omar knew that if anyone could help him unlock the true power of the Fatal Code, it was Juliet. When he found her, it did not take much to convince her of the seriousness of the situation. Years earlier, she had noticed that the Fatil Consortium was hiding more than just ordinary trade agreements. She knew that the Fatil were using a legal code dating back to an era long before their rise as a galactic power. The moment Omar revealed his findings about the right of secondary consultation, Juliet fell silent, as if the answer to that question had been stored in a dark corner of her mind, waiting to be awakened. She knew that despite their immense economic strength, the consortium was being manipulated by laws and traditions they barely understood. The civilizations the Fatil had subjugated were now, ironically, becoming their own prisons. But to unveil this power, Omar would need more than just linguistic knowledge. He would need a strategy that was both careful and bold. As they talked, Juliet revealed that the Fatal Consortium was governed by more than just language. Words and laws were intertwined with ancient rituals that, if correctly invoked, could turn the game in favor of those who mastered them. She explained that the Fatal legal system was rooted in ceremonial commercial practices, dating back to a pre-collapse civilization, an era of intergalactic governance long forgotten. These rituals, though antiquated, still held power in the context of trade negotiations. Juliet explained that the true potential of the right of secondary consultation was more than just reversing agreements. It was a way to dismantle the foundations upon which the Fatil had built their empire. The rules governing the Fatal were not just legal, but also spiritual and cultural. If Omar could understand these layers, he could invoke something far greater than any intergalactic negotiation. He could bring down an entire structure with a single word. Professor Roberts began showing Omar the archives she had accumulated over decades of study. Ancient records containing the secrets of civilizations that had preceded the Fatil. Each page revealed a complexity greater than the last. The ancient, Laws, with their intricate rituals and unparalleled depth, formed a web of meanings beyond mere superficial understanding. For each clause, there was a symbolic representation, an action that had to be performed for the negotiation to be considered legitimate. Omar realized that the key lay in how he could manipulate these symbols, in how he could reinterpret the rituals and apply these ancient laws to modern intergalactic negotiations. He was not merely playing with words, he was playing with the very foundations of Fatil's civilization. As he flipped through the archives, Omar came across an illustration of a commercial ritual that seemed as ancient as the consortium itself. The image depicted figures from various alien races participating in a ceremonial dance, a symbolic battle where agreements were made and undone based on each participant's ability to dance with the concepts of trade and power. The dance was a metaphor for the skill of manipulating the rules of a negotiation, and for the Fatil, it was one of their most sacred ceremonies. It was a representation of the laws governing their commercial interactions. Omar then understood that negotiation was not just about words or clauses. He would need to master the art of the ritual, the dance of negotiations. Simply invoking an ancient rite would not be enough. He would have to interpret the rituals and wield this symbolic language effectively. He would have to become part of the dance, not just an observer. Juliet, realizing that Omar was beginning to grasp the true depth of what was at stake, made a bold suggestion. You have the knowledge necessary to face the Fatil, but you'll need more than that. The key is in how you manipulate the rules of the ritual. They won't accept a human merely as a translator. You need to be more than a translator. You need to be a negotiator, a master of rituals, someone who understands the hidden meanings behind every word. If you don't adapt to their way of doing business, it will be a waste of time. The consortium doesn't see humans as equals. They only respect those who know how to play their game. Omar remained silent for a moment, absorbing his mentor's words. He knew that by accepting the role Daos had offered him, he was stepping into dangerous territory. He would no longer be just a translator. He would be someone who challenged an entire empire, manipulating the Fatil's words and rituals in favor of humanity. But to do that, he would need more than linguistic intelligence. He would need cunning, courage, and a willingness to break the rules. He had to be ready to play the game like never before. And that meant he had to master the art of intergalactic negotiation, transforming himself into a master of ancient rituals, and in doing so, becoming a true player on the galactic stage. The truth was becoming clear to him. The key to victory lay in mastering a lost language and the forgotten rules of a distant past. The power of words had never been more real than in that moment. But would he be able to wield that power? Would he be able to defeat an entire galaxy simply by understanding the true meaning of the words the Fatil spoke? He had no more doubts. The only way to win was to turn this lost language against them. Omar was ready. The decision was made, but the strategy needed to be flawless. When he sat before Bezis Bodis Syrian and the other members of the Fatil consortium, he knew this meeting would be the turning point. It was not just any intergalactic negotiation. It was a battle of wills, a clash between two civilizations with codes and legal systems as different as the sun and the moon. The Fatil, with their multiple eyes and imposing bodies, were not known for yielding easily, and the failures in the translators were no longer a mere technical error but a true opportunity. The words, the clauses, and the rituals of a forgotten civilization were within his grasp, and he knew that invoking the right of secondary consultation was his only chance to break the deadlock. But for that to be possible, he had to be more than a translator. He had to be a master, someone who not only understood the language but who could manipulate the very rules of the game. As the negotiations began, the atmosphere in the hall was heavy. The Fatil were confident, as always, believing they had complete control of the situation. But Omar felt the weight of the ancient words in his chest. He knew the moment to act had arrived. Suddenly, interrupting the flow of conversations and proposals, he stood up and, with a firm posture, recited the words that had been etched into his memory since his days of study with Juliet Roberts. By the first merchants, I invoke the right of secondary consultation. It was as if time had stopped. The whole fell into absolute silence, and even the facile translators, who would normally interpret words with speed, remained motionless. The impact of his words was immediate and profound. The fatile's reaction was visible. Bzis Bodhisarian, the leader of the consortium, stared at Omar with wide eyes. He knew exactly what that invocation meant, and what it meant for the fatile was nothing good. Omar felt the tension in the air, like a storm about to break loose. What he had done was risky, extremely risky, but also brilliant. He had not only evoked a legal right lost to time, but also challenged the consortium to confront the very rules they thought they had under control. For a moment, it seemed as if the fatile didn't know what to do. Their meticulously structured laws had been shattered by a single word, a word they had never imagined a human would dare to use. The very essence of the consortium was being turned upside down. They could not ignore the right of secondary consultation. It was a clause that could alter any agreement, any contract based on an ancient legal code. And the fatile knew that if they accepted it, they would be forced to reopen negotiations, rethink terms, and worse yet, submit to a review from a perspective they could not control. The hall was tense, with the fatile arguing among themselves, in their secret language, while Omar remained silent, waiting for their reaction. Daos, who stood beside Omar, looked at him with a mix of apprehension and admiration. He knew that, somehow, Omar had made the impossible happen, but what he didn't know was how deeply this move would affect the entire negotiation. The fatile lawyers and translators were now in a frenzy, trying to interpret what had just happened. Omar knew that at this moment he had irreversibly changed the rules of the game, but he also knew that this initial victory was not the end. It was only the beginning of a long and tortuous process, where the fatile would have to confront their own laws and where negotiations would have to be rethought from a new perspective. The impact was immediate, but the fatile were not willing to yield so easily. Instead of admitting defeat, they began questioning the legitimacy of what Omar had done. That was when Omar's true skills began to shine. He was not just a linguistics expert, he was a strategist. He knew the crucial moment would come when the fatile tried to overturn the situation, arguing that invoking such an ancient clause was a violation of norms. But Omar was already prepared for this. In his mind, he had an unbeatable counter-argument. He knew that the true power of the right of secondary consultation was not just in its invocation, but in how he could manipulate the legal rituals in his favor. He needed to ensure that the fatile did not feel threatened, but at the same time, pressure them into accepting what was happening. And so, the negotiation continued, with Omar growing more confident that he was on the right path. He knew the fatile were incredibly powerful, but he also understood that the strength of their civilization lay largely in how their own laws were structured. They believed they had control, but with the invocation of the right of secondary consultation, Omar had taken that control from their hands. The real battle was just beginning. He had not won yet, but he had taken the first step toward ensuring that humanity had a real chance of establishing itself as a power within intergalactic negotiations. And that, in itself, was already a victory of cosmic proportions. After invoking the right of secondary consultation, the atmosphere in the negotiation hall changed drastically. Omar knew that by challenging the fatile consortium with this ancient clause, he had set in motion something far greater than any trade or credit negotiation. The consortium was not going to simply yield, and he understood that to survive this new game, he would need to navigate the complex cultural and legal layers of the fatile. When the fatile realized the situation was slipping out of their control, they began invoking the ancient trade rituals, a set of practices that had been used for millennia to test and validate any significant negotiation. To the fatile, these rituals were more than mere formalities. They were manifestations of power, honor, and history. The dance, the poetry, and the intellectual challenges Omar would now face were representations of everything the fatile held sacred. The first ritual to be summoned was the interpretative asset dance battle, a symbolic test where participants were challenged to represent the value of their trade proposals through interpretative dance. Omar and Matthew Dowse were forced to participate, something that felt more like a spectacle than a real challenge. But for the Fatil, it was proof that trade intentions were not just spoken but physically expressed, with each movement representing an abstract idea about the market, value, and risk. The hall filled with energetic music, something alien, pulsing deep within the fibers of every participant. Omar knew that any mistake could cause the floor to heat up, forcing them to perform faster and more difficult movements. It was a game of physical and mental endurance, where each mistake was a commercial failure, and any failure could mean losing part of the deal. Omar was not a dancer, but his ability to read the intentions behind the Fatil's words and gestures was more valuable than any choreographed movement. He began to understand the symbols being conveyed through the dance. Every step, every gesture represented a risk in the intergalactic market. A faster movement indicated a bolder investment, while a softer step suggested a conservative proposal. He and Dowse were forced to translate not just words, but also emotions, risks, and market strategies. The hot floor increased the pressure, and Omar felt the heat rise with each misstep. But he stood firm. He was no longer just a translator of the Fatil language. He was becoming an interpreter of the very soul of the consortium. His sharp, trained mind translated the movements precisely, and the dance became a battlefield where words turned into laughter and falls, and intentions were laid bare for all to see. After the dance challenge, the next ritual was the haiku, competition on future markets, a task where participants were challenged to summarize their trade proposals in a poetic and symbolic way. Each haiku had to encapsulate the spirit of a business proposal, serving as a direct reflection of the intentions and risks involved. For the Fatil, poetry was not an art. It was a way to understand the future, to predict how negotiations would unfold, to capture the invisible vibrations of the market. Omar knew that, for the Fatil, mastery of poetry was a vital skill for conducting successful negotiations. As a human, he was not accustomed to using haiku as a negotiation tool, but he understood that his response had to be more than just words. It had to be a precise representation of risk, opportunity, and the inevitability of trade discussions. With Juliet Roberts' words still fresh in his mind, Omar composed a haiku that translated his proposal in a way the Fatil were not expecting. Every syllable was chosen with precision, each line representing an aspect of the negotiation that the Fatil considered taboo. Poetry was not just an art form, it was a symbolic key to unlocking the layers of meaning that the Fatil used to communicate. In business, Omar's haiku did not just describe the risk involved in his proposals. It manipulated words in a way the Fatil could not contest. He was turning the ritual against them, using the rules of poetry to showcase his strategic intelligence, and position himself as an equal, if not superior, to the Fatil in their own arena. The competition was fierce, but in the end, the Fatil could not deny that the human proposal carried something that challenged them, something they themselves could not fully understand. But the greatest challenge was still ahead. After the dance and poetry rituals, the Fatil invoked the trial of business competence, a symbolic test of commercial skills that took place within a trade arena. Each participant had to create a simulated battle where trade assets were exchanged, evaluated, and debated based on their economic relevance, using what the Fatil called the balance of power. For the Fatil consortium, commerce was not just an exchange of goods. It was a strategic war where every action carried immense tactical weight. Omar was put to the test, forced to use his linguistic skills and knowledge of the Fatil to manipulate the rules and ensure that trade was reopened under the clauses he had invoked. He knew that this arena was not just a simulation. It was the true battlefield for the future of intergalactic commerce, where victory meant a new balance of power. He was not just fighting for a negotiation. He was fighting for humanity's survival in the vast and immense galactic game. Omar used everything he knew, manipulating the rules of the game to ensure that the Fatil were in a position where they could no longer retreat. He was not just playing with words, he was playing with the very essence of the Fatil legal system. Every move he made in the negotiation arena seemed to have consequences beyond his perception. And with each challenge, Humanity was getting closer to securing its place in the vast galactic trade network. Even in a battlefield as absurd as the trial of business competence, Omar was turning the game in his favor, and the fatal were beginning to understand what was truly at stake. He was becoming more than just a translator. He was now a master of their rules, wielding the power of words and forgotten laws in what had become a true intergalactic revolution. Just when Omar thought he was in control, an unexpected factor entered the scene. During the intense trial of business competence, something unforeseen happened. As he manipulated the rules and used his linguistic skills to tip the balance of power in his favor, a low, almost imperceptible sound began to echo through the hall. It was as if an ancient spell was being reawakened. The Fatal Consortium, with all its wealth and power, had something Omar didn't know existed. A monitoring system based on ancient records, information safeguarded for millennia, only accessed in exceptional circumstances. And at that moment, without anyone realizing it, that system was automatically reactivated, triggering an audit that had lain dormant for centuries. The repercussions were immediate and astonishing. A series of lights and holographic screens lit up the hall, revealing information about the consortium that no one, not even the Fatal themselves, had seen in generations. The records from the ancient archives were exposed in a way the Fatal had never anticipated. This not only shocked the consortium's leaders, but also put their entire commercial system at risk. The Fatal Trade Consortium, once synonymous with intergalactic economic stability, was now being dismantled before everyone's eyes. What Omar and Daos didn't know was that by activating these ancient archives, a new set of rules was automatically enforced. Rules that mandated the reopening of trade routes that had been closed to humanity and other races. This reopening meant that humanity, which had so far been on the fringes of intergalactic commerce, now had a legitimate chance to enter the galactic trade game. Faced with an audit imposed by their own archives, the consortium had no choice but to comply. The Fatil, long accustomed to dominating negotiations through economic power and linguistic manipulation, were now being caught off guard. The intergalactic audit that had been initiated was not just an internal review, it involved a reassessment of the galaxy's trade routes, something that could reveal illegal monopolies, unfair trade practices, and even corruption among the intergalactic powers. Omar realized that by invoking the right of secondary consultation, he had not only delved deep into the Fatal legal system, but had also triggered a process that could expose the consortium's darkest secrets. The audit was being conducted by the Intergalactic Trade Commission, a powerful force capable of dismantling any monopoly or oppressive system. And the Fatal were now at the center of this investigation. For the first time, those who had been subjugated were now witnessing their oppressors being placed under scrutiny. For the Fatal, the exposure of their illegal trade practices was not something they could ignore. They had controlled the trade routes for so long that they believed themselves untouchable, but the ongoing intergalactic audit signaled the emergence of a new order. Those routes that had been closed to humanity, once deemed unreachable, were now being reopened, allowing humans to compete on equal footing with other intergalactic civilizations. The consortium no longer had absolute control over negotiations. Omar knew that power was finally shifting hands. The Fatal Trade Consortium, with all its arrogance and confidence, was now being challenged not just by an ancient clause, but by the revelation of its own corruption and unlawful practices. Baziz Bodis Serian, the consortium's leader, could not hide the despair in his eyes. He knew that the intergalactic audit would not be easy to contain. In a gesture that Omar recognized as a sign of defeat, Baziz reluctantly admitted that they were ready to accept a new round of negotiations. The balance of power, which had always favored the Fatal, had been overturned. The trade routes were reopened, and now humanity was in a position to demand a fair deal. His victory was not just a matter of trade negotiations, it was an intergalactic revolution. The audit not only exposed the consortium's failures, but also revealed its internal contradictions and the abuses of power that had been practiced for generations. The Fatal, at the height of their arrogance, were forced to yield. For Omar, that moment was more than just a simple victory. It was the realization of a dream that, as an academic, he had never imagined achieving. He had challenged one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy and, by using knowledge of the lost language, ancient laws and loopholes in the legal system, he had won. But more importantly, he had achieved something far greater. He had secured humanity's place in intergalactic trade. The trade routes, once a symbol of exclusion, were now open. The Fatal Consortium no longer held a monopoly, and in its place, a new era was beginning, one where humanity had a real chance to negotiate with the galactic powers. Omar's bold move, invoking the right of secondary consultation and inadvertently reactivating the ancient archives, had changed the course of history. But while the Fatal Consortium was now forced to negotiate in ways it had never imagined, one question still lingered. What would come next? The power of a single lost language had rewritten the rules of galactic commerce. But in doing so, Omar knew that the intergalactic game was only beginning, and he would still have to face many challenges to ensure that humanity remained a vital part of this new world of opportunities. After months of intense negotiations, bizarre challenges, and legal and cultural battles with the Fatal Trade Consortium, Omar's victory was finally solidified. But, as with any major intergalactic agreement, there was one final ritual to be fulfilled, a symbol of reconciliation and the closing of a chapter that had forever shifted the balance of power in the galaxy. It was time to hold the reconciliation. Potluck. For the Fatil, this symbolic feast was not just a way to seal trade agreements. It was a deeply rooted tradition in their beliefs, where each dish represented an aspect of the negotiation. It was a celebration of victories and losses, of renewed alliances and new possibilities. And for Omar, it was the final moment of a game he had played with unexpected skill. The reconciliation. Potluck was not just a simple banquet but a ceremony, filled with meaning, reflecting the agreement reached between the races. Each participant, human or Fatil, brought a dish that represented an aspect of the negotiation. For the Fatil, it was a way to show their willingness to accept the new balance of power that had been established. For humanity, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that, despite their previous outsider status, they were now ready to fully integrate into intergalactic trade. The banquet became a symbolic representation of how the negotiations had reshaped the trade routes and given humans a strong presence, a voice that would now be heard and respected in future intergalactic exchanges. Omar sat at the table, observing the Fatal and the other participants, feeling surreal in the midst of the event. He knew that, as an academic, he had never imagined that his expertise in xenolinguistics would bring him to this moment, participating in an intergalactic ceremony that sealed a new destiny for humanity. The dish he had brought represented the renewal of the trade routes that would now be open to humans, a symbol of the struggle he and Daos had fought, and of the negotiations that had rewritten the future. As he watched the Fatal share their symbolic culinary contributions, a deep sense of accomplishment washed over him. He had not only won a battle of words and symbols, but had also ensured that humanity held an equal position in the great galactic negotiations. There was no longer room for monopolies or for the dominance of a single race. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. As the banquet unfolded, the atmosphere carried a peculiar tranquility, a celebration of both victories and the concessions made. Omar couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The journey that had begun with a simple translation job had turned into an intergalactic revolution, a game changer where humanity had not only exceeded expectations but had paved a new path for all galactic beings willing to fight for justice and equality. And yet, he knew that this reconciliation potluck was not the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. Humanity was now seated at the table of the great intergalactic powers, but would they be able to maintain this newfound balance? The trust that had been earned now needed to be sustained, which meant that humanity would have to keep playing the game wisely, strategically, and carefully. As the banquet continued and dishes were shared among the participants, Omar realized an important truth. The true power lay in language, not just in words, but in the ability to negotiate, to understand the unspoken rules of a system, and to know when to challenge those rules to create something fairer. He had shown the Fatil that, although humanity was young compared to other civilizations, its adaptability and understanding of the power of words could change the course of history. But, more importantly, he had demonstrated that humanity had a crucial role to play in the galaxy, not just as merchants or consumers, but as skilled negotiators capable of learning and manipulating the rules of intergalactic trade with the same mastery as any other race. Omar smiled at Daos, who sat beside him, watching what seemed to be the realization of his vision. The victory was complete, and humanity was now positioned to compete on equal footing with the great intergalactic powers. Yet, as the reconciliation banquet unfolded, Omar felt a twinge of curiosity. What else lay hidden between the lines of the negotiations? What other secrets and forces were waiting to be uncovered in the vast galaxy? He knew that despite this great triumph, the real struggle was only beginning. He had taken a step toward humanity's future, but that future was filled with challenges and opportunities, and he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. As the banquet drew to a close and the negotiations were formally sealed, one last message from Juliet Roberts echoed in his mind. Remember, Omar, humanity is not defined by what it conquers, but by how history remembers us. History had just been written, but his role in it was far from over. The reconciliation. Potluck had sealed the peace, but it was through today's continued actions and decisions that the future of humanity, as a new galactic power, would be decided. And so, as the Fatil and humans raised their glasses to a new beginning, Omar knew that his journey was only just beginning, and the true intergalactic game was about to enter an even deeper and more unpredictable level. The reconciliation. Potluck ceremony had finally come to an end, yet the echoes of words, challenges, victories, and losses still resonated in Omar's heart. The symbolic banquet marked the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another, far bolder. Humanity, once seen as a young species with no significant place among the intergalactic powers, now stood tall, not just as a participant, but as an active force in galactic trade. The Fatil Trade Consortium, which had controlled intergalactic trade routes for millennia, was now forced to yield, to reassess its dominance, and above all, to respect the emerging forces that were now playing by the very rules they had once dictated. Omar, with his sharp intellect and his ability to manipulate not only language, but also the laws, rituals, and codes of an alien empire, had become an unexpected hero. But he knew that what he had achieved was only the beginning. He was not just transforming trade negotiations. He was shaping the very destiny of humanity among the stars. The knowledge he had accessed, the ability to decipher the codes of ancient civilizations, had made him one of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy. But Omar also understood that, like any great victory, this new era of intergalactic peace and prosperity was far from immune to challenges. The balance of power had shifted, but the forces that always sought to restore the old order would not surrender easily. What had begun as a simple translation task had evolved into a movement that defied the laws and systems governing the galaxies. It was not just the power of words in a lost language that had brought humanity to the center of intergalactic trade. It was the power of a human mind that knew, at the right moment, when to use ancient knowledge to its advantage. Humanity was now playing a galactic game where every move was crucial. But more importantly, they had learned something fundamental. True strength did not lie in wealth or military might, but in the ability to understand the rules, and even more so, in the courage to change them. The history of humanity would never be the same. Omar, bearing the weight of his newfound position, couldn't help but look toward the future with a sense of cautious confidence. He knew that more challenges would come, but humanity was now armed with something few had expected: the power of its own history and the ability to use it to influence a vast and unpredictable universe. Daos, who had been an ally throughout the journey, was now more aware than ever that the true power of intergalactic negotiations lay in the ability to look beyond trade exchanges and see the hidden depths of these systems. And as Omar gazed at the vast galaxy, he felt a wave of gratitude for being part of this historic moment, but also a sense that the real story was still being written. Humanity had much to offer, and it was no longer seen as a mere spectator on the great galactic stage. They were now an integral part of the game, playing with the same cards, on equal footing with any civilization that ruled the stars. The Fatil Consortium, though still powerful, now understood that it was no longer alone. It had been challenged by a new force, a force of transformation, and that would change the course of intergalactic history forever. But one final lesson still lingered over Omar and all of humanity. History is not defined by a single event or victory. It is shaped by choices, by strategic moves, and above all, by a deep understanding of the forces that govern the universe. And as he looked toward the future, Omar knew that with humanity now at the center of this great galactic game, it was only a matter of time before new negotiations, new battles, and perhaps even a new revolution began to take shape. Yet deep down he felt that humanity was finally ready for whatever the future had in store. Now it was humanity's turn to define its own path, not just with words but with actions. The stars were within reach, and this was only the beginning of an even greater journey. And now, with everything that has happened, what will become of humanity's future? This isn't just about a successful negotiation. It's about the reconfiguration of the entire intergalactic game. The great galactic powers now know that humanity is no longer on the sidelines of space commerce. Now, we are a force to be reckoned with. But as you well know, every great achievement brings new challenges. The doors that have been opened are not just opportunities, they are also responsibilities. The road ahead will be filled with new challenges, negotiations, and even conflicts. But one thing is certain, humanity now has the tools to stand strong in this game. And who knows? Maybe the next great story will be about how humanity, with its intelligence, cunning, and the power of language, conquers even more in the universe. Now, before you go, take a moment and ask yourself, what comes next? What secrets does the universe still hold? And how can you, as part of this human civilization, also help shape the course of history? Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next intergalactic journey. The future is just beginning. Are you ready to follow it? Click now, and I'll see you in the next adventure.